The lecture hall buzzed with quiet chatter as students shuffled papers and opened laptops. At the front of the room, Professor Harris stood with a piece of chalk in hand, scanning the rows of faces like a hawk. He had a reputation for being strict, even cruel, and he seemed to enjoy putting students on the spot. Every week, he would call on someone to solve a problem in front of the class, often choosing the shyest student he could find. That morning, his eyes landed on Emily. She sat near the back of the hall, her head lowered, her notebook neatly filled with precise notes. She rarely spoke in class, never raising her hand, and Harris had taken notice of her silence. A smirk tugged at his lips as he tapped the chalk against the blackboard and called out her name. Emily froze. Dozens of heads turned to look at her, and her heart raced in her chest. She stood slowly, clutching her notebook as if it were a shield, and walked to the front of the room. Harris turned to the board and began sketching a long, winding equation filled with integrals and trigonometric terms. The class went quiet as they saw the complexity of the problem. It was the kind of equation that took most students half an hour to even begin. Harris stepped back and handed the chalk to Emily with a smug smile, saying, "Let us see what you can do." Some students shifted uncomfortably while others leaned forward, eager to watch the spectacle. Emily took the chalk and for a brief moment stared at the board. Her pulse slowed, and the nervous chatter in her head fell away. This was not unfamiliar territory to her. She had worked through problems far more complicated in the quiet of her room. With a calm breath, she began writing the first steps, her hand steady and confident. The sound of chalk against the board filled the hall as she moved quickly. One by one, the terms simplified, and the sprawling equation began to shrink. The students blinked in surprise, whispering to each other as they realized she was not hesitating at all. Her pace never faltered, her focus unbroken as line after line fell into place. Within minutes, Emily reached the final step and wrote down the exact solution. She placed the chalk back on the ledge with a quiet finality and turned to face the professor. The room was silent, wide-eyed students staring at her as if they could not believe what they had just witnessed. Emily simply returned to her seat without a word, her expression calm, as though she had solved nothing more than a simple homework exercise. Professor Harris stood frozen at the front of the room, his smirk gone, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in years, it was not a student left speechless, but him. The silence in the hall stretched on like a heavy curtain, refusing to lift. Then a ripple of whispers spread among the students, some filled with amazement, others with disbelief. A few even began to clap softly, though they quickly stopped, afraid of how Professor Harris might react. He cleared his throat and straightened his tie, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He tried to regain control of the room by insisting that Emily had only solved the problem because it was simpler than it looked. But the truth hung in the air too clearly for anyone to believe his excuse. Emily had done in minutes what most of them could not have finished in an entire class period. Harris glanced at her notebook lying open on her desk, filled with neat lines of equations and calculations that showed her quiet dedication. One student in the front row raised his hand, asking if Emily's solution could be explained step by step. Harris hesitated, his pride keeping him from admitting defeat, but the class waited expectantly. At last, he gestured stiffly toward Emily, inviting her to walk them through the process. She rose again, this time with less hesitation, and approached the board with a soft confidence in her stride. Her voice was calm as she explained each step. She broke the problem down into small parts, showing the logic that guided her. Students leaned forward in their seats, taking notes quickly as if they did not want to miss a word. Even the ones who had smirked at her shyness before now looked at her with quiet respect. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing again, not with doubt, but with admiration. Emily returned to her seat and for the first time lifted her head high enough to meet the stares of her classmates. She did not need their applause or their whispers, she had already proven herself. But inside, she felt something she had not in a long time, a spark of pride that came from finally being seen. Professor Harris stood stiffly at the front of the room, gripping the edge of his desk as though it might steady him. He was not used to losing control of his carefully crafted stage, and Emily had done it without even trying. The students continued to buzz around him, trading notes, pointing at the board, and whispering about how quickly she had worked through the problem. For the first time, the lecture hall felt less like his domain and more like hers. Emily quietly tucked her notebook into her bag as if preparing to vanish back into the background. But a voice from the middle row broke through the chatter asking if she could help explain another concept from the homework. The request was genuine, not mocking, and it drew the attention of nearly everyone in the hall. Emily froze for a moment, her instinct telling her to retreat, yet something in the earnestness of the voice made her pause. She lifted her gaze and found herself nodding slowly. Harris tried to interrupt, stepping forward to remind class that he was still the instructor, but the momentum had shifted. Another student chimed in asking if Emily could share how she studied so effectively. Soon, several voices overlapped with questions, and for the first time the professor was no longer the center of attention. Emily took a deep breath and answered softly, her words careful but clear. She explained that she spent hours breaking problems into smaller parts and practicing them until they felt natural. Her tone was modest, but her explanation carried a precision that showed her deep understanding. Students scribbled her advice eagerly, and even those who had once ignored her listened closely. Harris clenched his jaw watching the scene unfold. It was his lecture, yet all eyes were on her, and nothing he did could pull them back. The chalkboard still displayed her flawless solution, standing as proof that his attempt to humiliate her had backfired completely. And though Emily spoke with humility, every sentence deepened the respect of those around her. Emily sat back down after answering a few more questions, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed. Where there had once been a wall between her and her classmates, now there was curiosity and even admiration. A few students leaned toward her whispering thanks, while others smiled in quiet encouragement. Emily felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her posture steady, her hands folded neatly over her notebook. Professor Harris forced a cough to draw attention back to himself, but the energy in the room did not shift as easily as it once had. He launched into his prepared lecture about limits and continuity, yet the eyes of the students flicked often toward Emily. Every time he paused for a response, students glanced in her direction, waiting to see if she would speak. Harris noticed it too, and each glance seemed to chip away at the authority he guarded so fiercely. Emily sensed the tension, but she did not gloat. Instead, she lowered her eyes and continued to take notes quietly, as she always had. Still, there was no hiding the way her classmates now regarded her, with a kind of quiet awe. For the first time, she was not invisible. When class ended, a small group of students gathered near her desk. They asked if she would be willing to study with them before the next exam. Emily hesitated and used to being asked for help, but their sincerity left little room for doubt. She gave a small nod and agreed to meet them in the library later that week. As she left the hall, her steps felt lighter than usual. The murmur of students still carried her name in tones of respect and surprise. Behind her, Professor Harris remained at the desk, his chalk untouched, his gaze fixed on the equations still lingering on the board. It was a reminder he could not erase of how his plan to expose a shy student had instead revealed her brilliance. Emily walked out of the lecture hall into the crisp afternoon air, her notebook pressed tightly against her chest. The campus lawn was alive with students moving between classes, yet she felt strangely separate from the crowd, as though she was still carrying the quiet hum of the room with her. A few classmates passed by and offered her nods of recognition, one even giving her a quick thumbs up before hurrying away. It was subtle, but it was more acknowledgement than she had ever received in all her weeks at the university. She found a bench under a large oak tree and sat down, letting the moment sink in. For so long she had tried to remain invisible, hoping no one would notice her. Yet in the span of one lecture, she had become the focus of every eye in the room. And strangely enough, it had not been as terrifying as she once imagined. Her phone buzzed with a message from a number she did not recognize. It was one of the students who had asked to study with her earlier. They were already setting up a group chat, hoping she would join. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment before quietly typing a yes. Later that week, she stepped into the library and found the group already waiting at a large wooden table. Books and notebooks were spread out across it, and they waved her over eagerly. At first, Emily kept her voice soft, answering only when asked, but as the session went on, her confidence grew. She explained concepts with clarity, breaking down problems in ways that made her classmates lean in closer to listen. The more she spoke, the more she realized she had been holding back a part of herself for too long. Her shyness had kept her in the shadows, but her love for math had always burned bright beneath the surface. Now that light was beginning to reach others, and for the first time, she was not afraid of it. And somewhere deep inside, she wondered how far it might carry her if she stopped hiding completely. Weeks passed, and Emily became a familiar face in the library study sessions. What had started as a hesitant experiment slowly turned into a routine she looked forward to every day. Her classmates not only admired her skill but also her patience, the way she never made anyone feel small when they struggled. Word spread quietly through the campus that the shy girl from the back row was someone you wanted on your side if calculus left you lost. One afternoon, while the group worked through a set of particularly difficult integrals, the professor walked by their table. He stopped mid-step, his sharp eyes landing on Emily, who was leaning over a notebook explaining each step with calm precision. The students around her were nodding, scribbling notes, and following her guidance closely. The professor said nothing, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, a mix of curiosity and perhaps a hint of unease before he moved on. Emily noticed, but kept her focus on the problem at hand. Her hands no longer trembled when she held the pen, her voice no longer caught when she spoke. It was as though each solved equation was stitching together a stronger version of herself piece by piece. The library became her second home, the quiet aisles and wooden tables offering her a stage far less intimidating than the lecture hall. Here she did not feel mocked or underestimated. Here she was simply valued for what she could do and who she was. One evening, as the group packed up their books, a student looked at her with a grin. "You know, Emily, you could probably teach this class better than the professor." The others laughed in agreement, but Emily only smiled softly, her cheeks warm. The thought lingered, though, planting itself quietly in her heart, where dreams she never dared to name were beginning to grow. The next lecture arrived with a buzz in the air. The professor entered carrying a stack of papers, his glasses perched low on his nose. Without preamble, he announced a surprise challenge for the entire class. He wrote a long, complex differential equation across the board, one that sprawled from corner to corner like a tangled web. The students shifted uneasily, some sighing, some already defeated by the sight of it. Emily sat still, her eyes following each symbol, each fraction and derivative, as though they were words in a story she already understood. The professor set down the chalk and turned slowly to face the room, his gaze sharp. "Who among you can solve this?" he asked, his tone both taunting and expectant. No one moved, at first the silence heavy. Then a voice from the back spoke up. "Emily can do it." All heads turned toward her. Emily felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but this time she did not shrink back. Her classmates were not mocking her, their faces were filled with trust and quiet encouragement. Slowly, she rose, her notebook clasped in her hands, and walked to the front of the room. The professor stepped aside, his eyes unreadable. Emily lifted the chalk, it felt cool and solid between her fingers. She began writing, her steps clear, deliberate, each line flowing into the next. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the scratch of chalk on the board. Step by step, the mess of symbols unraveled under her hand. She did not rush, she simply followed the rhythm of the logic that had become second nature to her. Minutes passed, and finally, she placed the chalk down, her work filling the board in perfect order. She turned quietly and looked at the professor. Her classmates broke into applause, the sound echoing against the high ceiling. The professor did not stop them, nor did he scold her. Instead, he studied the solution with narrowed eyes and then looked back at Emily, his expression unreadable, but not dismissive. The applause carried on, and Emily stood still, unsure whether to step back to her seat or wait for the professor to speak. The professor finally raised his hand, and the room slowly quieted down. He turned back to the board and read through every line of her work, his lips moving silently as he traced each symbol with his finger. The tension in the room was thick, every student waiting to see if he would dismiss her effort or acknowledge it. At last, he set the chalk on the ledge and faced Emily. "This is correct," he said, his voice steady and even. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle into the room. "Not just correct, but efficient. Your steps are clean, no wasted effort." Emily felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sudden attention that wrapped around her like a spotlight. The professor adjusted his glasses and studied her face, as though seeing her for the first time. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, her hands clutching her notebook. "I practiced," she said softly, almost a whisper. "I like solving problems." A murmur rippled through the class, some students exchanging glances, others nodding in silent respect. The professor did not dismiss her answer. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if filing away her response for later. He turned back to the class and said, "You will all do well to study this solution. There is much to learn here." Emily walked back to her seat, her legs trembling, but her heart lighter than it had ever been in that classroom. Her classmates looked at her differently, now not with amusement or indifference, but with quiet admiration. The girl who had once been invisible was no longer ignored. After class, Emily packed her notebook slowly, her mind still replaying the events at the board. Students lingered around her desk, some offering congratulations, others asking questions about her method. She answered as best she could, keeping her voice soft but steady. It felt strange to be the center of attention, yet it was not uncomfortable. For the first time, she realized that being noticed for her skill could feel rewarding instead of frightening. Professor Harris gathered his papers and left the room, his usual sharp stride slower than usual. Emily noticed and glanced back at her once before disappearing down the hall. She wondered if he was reflecting on what had just happened or planning how to adjust his lectures for the rest of the semester. Either way, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing she had proven herself in a way he could not dismiss. Over the next few days, whispers and quiet conversations followed her from lecture to lecture. Her classmates approached her for help with assignments and exam preparation. Emily agreed cautiously at first, but soon discovered she enjoyed explaining her process. The confidence she had hidden for so long began to grow, and the walls she had built around herself slowly started to crumble. One evening, after a long study session in the library, she packed her bag and walked outside. The campus was bathed in golden light, and she felt a strange calm settle over her. She realized that her shyness no longer defined her. Her knowledge and patience had opened doors she had never thought possible. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what might come next. As the weeks passed, Emily continued to excel. Her quiet presence in the lecture hall became a source of inspiration for her classmates. Professor Harris still held his pride, but he no longer tried to humiliate her. Instead, he began to respect her insight and even sought her perspective on challenging problems. Emily found herself invited to study groups, mentoring other students, and eventually assisting in tutoring sessions. Each time she helped someone else understand a difficult concept, she felt a quiet joy and confidence grow inside her. Her shyness had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer held her back. She had learned that her voice and her mind mattered. By the end of the semester, Emily was no longer the shy girl at the back of the room. She was a respected student whose brilliance could not be ignored. Professor Harris gave her a nod of acknowledgement the last day of class, and she returned it with a small smile. For Emily, the real victory was not just solving equations, but discovering the strength and confidence she had always carried within herself.